Hello, my name is Peter Edge, and I'm Professor of Law at Oxford Brookes Law School. What I want to do in this final paper is draw together some of the ideas we talked about throughout the day and lay out a possible agenda for research. So, a shape for future work in this common area, reflecting on some of the practicalities about how we may make that possible. So, one of the themes from today, I think, has been how specificity really matters, that the different small democracies that we're interested in need to be taken seriously on their own terms as individual places. So, if you like, what our starting points are. And so, I want to talk a little bit about my starting point. I'm a Manx lawyer and I'm a Manx lawyer. So, I am Manx, but one of my research specialisms is Manx law, in particular Manx constitutional and public law, which I tend to view through a legal history lens. So I'm quite interested in not only understanding where we are now, but also how we got to this point. So I come from the Isle of Man. The Isle of Man is part of what we might call the Atlantic Archipelago or the British Isles. So you can see from this satellite map where it's placed. It's an island nation, one inhabited island and one very much smaller uninhabited one. So it's not an islands nation, it's an island nation. Population is around 85,000, 49% Manx born, 43% UK born. It's never been assimilated into England, Great Britain, or the United Kingdom in a legal sense. So there's always been a specific jurisdictional identity associated with the nationality, the national identity of the Isle of Man. And today, it's largely autonomous, self-governing dependency of the British Crown. It's often classed together with Jersey and Guernsey as a Crown dependency. And so it is not part of the UK, and yet the UK has some residual roles in relation to particular issues around international relations, for instance. But for the vast majority of Manx life and the vast majority of Manx legal life, it is autonomous. So what happens in the Isle of Man is essentially driven by decisions made within the Isle of Man. So moving from that starting point and into the context of today, which is bringing people together from lots of different disciplines, lots of different professional backgrounds, and crucially, lots of different small democracies. I'm going to outline a possible agenda for research, which builds on ideas we began to discuss right from Caroline's paper at the start of the day. Colleagues who've wrestled with securing funding from UKRI will recognise my headings. So vision, approach, goals, outputs, and inputs. Because I'm trying to be quite specific, showing what this agenda for research may look like, I'm going to come across as quite dogmatic. And what I want to really stress is that this is one possible agenda for research, not necessarily the agenda for research for all of us, if such a thing could exist, and not necessarily something which is set in stone even for the first bit of movement. So I'm going to start by drawing on the broader literature on small democracies to lay out four analytical frames which I think could drive a vision for a research agenda. So, four theoretical frames which I think tell us useful and interesting things about what's going on in an individual small democracy and allows us to do some interesting comparisons. And my first frame is going to be that of capacity. Now, we're not necessarily talking lack of wealth here. Some of the small democracies that I'm interested in are some of the wealthiest territories in the world. Others are subject to serious disadvantage. But even if we look at the small democracies with a very high GDP, such as the Isle of Man, for instance, there is still a low absolute cap on income and expenditure on criminal justice. There are a limited number of people, albeit with a high average GDP, contributing to the fiscal resources of the Isle of Man. And so there is not an unlimited pot. There is, in many ways, an increasingly constrained pot in many countries around the world. And within that, they need to face the difficulty of providing specialist provision or separate provision, which in a larger country may be much easier to roll out. You may have simply the scale allowing you to provide specialist capacity. Let me give you an example from the Isle of Man. If we think of prison space as a simple proportion of total population, a relatively small absolute increase could overwhelm capacity, which on the population seems entirely reasonable. So there are times in the past when Manx judges have been sentencing criminals and have explicitly said that they are not able to impose a prison sentence because the prison is being stretched to capacity. And so as a result, have given an alternative sentence that they would not otherwise have imposed. But I think the significant challenges are not so much absolute capacity, but specialist provision. In the Isle of Man, for instance, for many years, children and young offenders who received custodial sentences were placed in the adult provision. So they were placed in the adult prison. Eventually, specialist provision was built for young offenders, but that itself has had its problems of focus. Women are still housed in a small prison, same prison as the male majority, albeit in a different wing. Very long-term prisoners, as in the past, but now with a good legal framework, are placed off island on the basis that their special needs are better met in a different country rather than trying to accommodate them on island. So the Isle of Man has its own national prison provision, and if you're interested, there's a lively and controversial docu docu-soap, docudrama called The Best Little Prison in Britain, which covers the Manx prison. So there is an in-island prison, but these particular challenges of capacity tied with smallness means that actually prison provision is quite complicated. My second frame is that of intimacy. Now, everybody knows everyone else's business can be an exaggeration in a small democracy, but not a completely ridiculous one. There is a high degree of interaction across multiple roles and geographic proximity. And the global literature suggests that this makes applying neutral rules impersonally and structuring interactions formally may be very difficult. Now, I think this intimacy is absolutely crucial to understanding law, politics in a small democracy. And a project I've recently finished looking at women in Manx politics really highlighted the importance of this intimacy in their experience as politicians, even and perhaps especially in an era of social media. So if we think about this in a criminal justice context, the example I'd like to give is lay finders of fact. I've recently started to look into some legal issues in Jersey and Guernsey. And one of the things that has really struck me is the distinctiveness of the jurat system. So jurats, the College of Jurats, are a group of lay individuals who are unpaid, who give up extremely substantial amounts of their own time for an extended period. We are talking high numbers of years. And as part of their very varied role, they are the finders of facts in the most serious criminal cases. So if you are charged with murder in the Isle of Man, you will have a jury trial. If you are charged with murder in Jersey, you will have a trial presided over by a judge, but where the finders of facts are members of the College of Jurats. So not an ad hoc jury established for your particular trial, but a standing body of officials. Reflecting on this, one of the arguments in favour of the jurat system is that they can be trained and supported in how to manage the implications on relationships of their particular role. So they are part of a supportive body, all of whom wrestle with this, all of whom gain experience over the years. So one of the arguments that I've heard about why the jurat system is good for finders of facts in a place like Jersey is that they are better able to act neutrally despite the complicated interweaving of relationships. I think there are counter arguments we can put forward, and I think it's really interesting that jury trials are very common in in the BOTs and in the Isle of Man. And so there are mechanisms in play there, and Joe talks about this in his paper, which also struggle to deal with the intimacy, the everyone knowing each other's business, everyone being connected. So I think intimacy is another one of those analytical frames that can really inform our research as we go forward. My third frame is connectedness. And we see this particularly with regional neighbours. So you will see uh, relationships between different small democracies within the Caribbean, for instance, but also with the historic hub, which realistically tends to mean the colonial hub. So there are connections between these small democracies with neighbours, but also with often with a particular large democracy. And this is just part of a broader issue around globalization. So globalization means that connectedness is not simply to the colonial hub, so the Isle of Man to London, as we would have seen in the 19th century, but actually it is a connection between the Isle of Man and the rest of the world. And this is particularly the case for those countries which have developed a substantial international finance part of their national portfolio. So those who have built up an international finance business, which makes a substantial contribution to the national economy. I'm going to give three criminal justice examples. The first around international finance. International finance is an important source of revenue for some small democracies, and in some cases, a very high proportion of their GDP. How do they deal with international financial crime? One of the particular challenges is that because of their limited capacity, the issue I raised earlier, they can be perceived by international financial crime groups as less capable adversaries. So a good location for criminal activities because their law enforcement investigation capacity is less powerful. In 2024, for instance, a group of Chinese nationals were convicted in China for a large scale multi year fraud operation operated from the Isle of Man. This is part of a broader movement of international organised crime in the smaller democracies, primarily around online gambling, fraud, and money laundering. Secondly, and I have to admit, much more speculatively, there has been a real growth in the size of national shipping registers in small democracies. Those with a relationship with the UK come within an umbrella organisation called the Red Ensign Group. This does not affect the individual jurisdictions over ships flagged in a particular country. So a cruise ship flagged in Bermuda, and Bermuda has a very substantial uh, cruise ship registry. A cruise ship flagged in Bermuda is, for many purposes, Bermudan territory. So a major or complex incident in international waters on a Bermudan cruise ship would fall within the Bermudan jurisdiction. This raises the question of whether these small democracies, which have radically increased the size of their shipping register, whether their capacity to discharge legal obligations in relation to those ships has kept pace. The high profile disappearance of Rebecca Corium, who I have pictured, from the Bahamian registered Disney Wonder in 2011, gives an example of this. There was substantial criticism of the investigation of her disappearance, which was carried out by a single Bahamian detective who was sent to investigate and raise questions over a very limited time period. Speaking in the UK Parliament, Stephen Mosley MP has criticised the Bahamian police as, quotes, internationally recognised as almost toothless. Very few people know when they board a cruise ship they are so poorly protected. And the third thing I wanted to point out was the connectedness of professionalism. So the idea that criminal justice professions are linked to other larger jurisdictions. Apart from the Manx Advocate, pretty much all Manx professions, and certainly all relevant to our discussion, are piggybacked off the UK profession. So probation officers in the prison and probation service, we can see links to UK training there. Police officers in the Knights Society, we can see links there. So there are some complicated practical connections which tie into the professional practice in criminal justice because of the nature of the profession. And then my final frame, I appreciate it does not apply to every small democracy, but it applies to a very large number of them, and it certainly applies to the ones which are of particular interest to me. So many small democracies are small island or small islands democracies. There is a boundedness provided by the sea border, which has been studied in terms of the sociological and the political and the economic implications. I also think that, in particular, in relation to the territories I'm mainly interested in, the Crown Dependencies, we have seen an emphasis on borders, which was not the case even earlier in this century. So I'm going to suggest two things which have kicked in here. The first, and I think less important, was Brexit. So Brexit has required a reconceptualization of borders, of free flow, of what the unit within which the Crown Dependence is operating actually consists of. And to me, it's given a new emphasis to the common travel area, which is a considerably older set of ideas and legal rules. But I think that's secondary. I think what was absolutely crucial was the coronavirus pandemic. This, for the Isle of Man in particular, was the first instance when border control was seen as a national resource to deal with a national crisis. We have had restrictions in the past, we have had emergency powers exercised in the past. They have always been exercised by the UK government within the UK government structure. The global pandemic, the Isle of Man made its own choices, some of which were very controversial, about border control. And I think what has happened is an awareness of the potency of border control has led to a new emphasis within the Isle of Man, and I think also the other Crown dependencies, on border control. So we are an island, we have the sea around us, we are placed in a position to make some sorts of interventions into criminal justice through control of what happens at our border. So those are comparative analytical frames that I think we could use to form our understanding of any comparative criminal justice research project in this area. What I want to suggest now is a particular approach we could take, which I am calling egalitarian comparativism. So, my starting point is that different small legal systems are wrestling with similar challenges posed by smallness. Their starting point is different, the way it works out is different, but fundamental challenges around the issues I talked about, for instance, capacity and intimacy, are going to play out and be relevant across our different jurisdictions. Taking comparative study seriously, recognise how difficult it is to capture a single jurisdiction, even a small one. I'm sure I'm not alone in having had the experience of people assuming that because I know Manx law, I must also know Caymanian law. I must also know Jersey law and Guernsey law. Yes, there are some things about being a researcher in a small democracy which lets you identify the right questions to ask, but that is very different from actually knowing the law of these different countries, let alone the political context, let alone the historical context. So to me, taking egalitarian comparativism seriously means that we recognize how difficult and important it is to take each jurisdiction as its own jurisdiction, but also that we reject an overemphasis on the former, or in some cases current, colonial power, and also that of other large democracies. There is always something to be learned from looking at the global literature on particular issues as they are dealt with by the large democracies. But what I am saying is that the things that they wrestle with are not necessarily the same as the particular problems facing small democracy because of the characteristics of smallness. So, to me, putting these together, the way to develop our understanding of a particular issue is a network of genuine national expertise within small democracies rather than flying faculty from a larger democracy. So, rather than, for instance, a very knowledgeable New York University scholar flying out to BVI to do some work at the BVI and then fly back out again. We actually need to build up that expertise, which implies not only to the project but to the hinterland within which it happens. So put these together, and to me, the way to develop a good research project in this area, to develop a strong research agenda, is to emphasize the value of a research network. So taking this as the vision and as the approach, what should be the goals of our research? I think we can all, without hesitation, agree we're in favour of improving criminal justice in small democracies. That does not seem like a contentious ask. But I think as we start to unpack what we mean by improving, we are likely to quickly find ourselves in a much more divisive and yet more interesting discussion. So, what frameworks could we use to decide whether a change was an improvement? So, the way in which we evaluate what improving actually means. I think there's three which are relevant to the way I look at things. The first is I am largely driven by international standards. So I think international human rights standards are really valuable. The distinctiveness and the specialness of small democracies, to me, does not radically change the value of this overarching international human rights standard to understanding national law. So, taking UDHR as an example, we'd obviously be concerned about fair trial rights, but also family and privacy rights, freedom of expression rights, etc., etc. So, one framework about improving would be coming into harmony with international human rights standards. Another, which I think is slightly more controversial, I think cost effectiveness is also a legitimate framework. So, if we can identify a particular way of achieving criminal justice goal which is cheaper, then that to me would be an improvement. Using limited resources as well as possible may allow improvement in other areas. This is not a situation where there is going to be um, a profit taker from these improvements on the whole. It is much more likely that it would free up parts of national budget which could be spent on desirable improvements elsewhere in criminal justice. And my third and perhaps most controversial framework, I think developing autonomy is also a legitimate framework. Criminal justice is something which is of massive public concern within a democracy, profound importance to society, and it's recognized as profoundly important. And I think it is crucial that decisions around criminal justice are made within the society to which those decisions are applied. So, within the particular context of autonomy for small democracies, I think that we could legitimately say that a step which improved autonomy, which put more control over the key decisions into the hands of national bodies, would also be an improvement. And just in passing, I've referred elsewhere to not wishing to use flying faculty in projects. Another way of improving autonomy is building national capacity for research and in particular for policy research. So that to me is also something which would go into the mix of my agenda. What about the outputs? What do we see coming out at the end of a successful project? We're likely to have findings. The question really is where do we wish those findings and the broader work we've carried out to appear to become available to others. So I think one important route is the academic route. So we can contribute to the state of the art, not only in relation to our own jurisdiction, but also in relation to thinking by other people working in different small jurisdictions and global scholarship more broadly. So it feels to me that what I've talked about so far would very naturally lend itself to academic outputs. One possibility is a collaborative research journal article. So a relatively small piece, these are typically between 6 and 12,000 words, multiple authored, bringing together the expertise, which I've already mentioned in relation to a research network. And I'm just finishing off actually a collaborative chapter with a colleague on assisted dying across the common travel area, and our complementary expertise has made that a really enjoyable and productive process. Slightly bigger journals occasionally will put out calls for special issues where every article or the vast majority of the articles that appear in the academic journal uh, are tied to a single theme or issue. And that to me would be something where a comparison looking at a big issue in detail in a number of different jurisdictions may naturally lend itself to a special issue. And there are particular journals, for instance, the Journal of Small States and Territories, which it feels to me would be a natural home for the sort of work which I'm proposing. And then the third possible source, edited collections. A publisher produces a book which brings together chapters ideally well focused around unifying themes, which bring out the complexity and the specificity of the different jurisdictions. And so I would point particularly at this collection, this 2024 collection, edited by Danny Peters, as an example of how that might work. But I think the academic outputs will not be the whole story. One of the things we tried to do today is bring together not just people from different academic disciplines, but also from different professions. So we are interested in research which has a policy input. So not just developing state of the art, but also aiming to improve lives in the small democracies in which we're interested. And this requires outputs aimed at the policymaker, not simply generated by the academic. It it is not the case that you can simply produce an academic output, email it to somebody in the national legislature that you're interested in, and something will happen. So you need to write for policymakers. You need to spend time in developing your policy input rather than just assuming it will happen naturally from your academic output. Can be cross-jurisdictional, bringing different insights from different jurisdictions to bear on a particular issue. And it can be aimed at specific policymakers or policy-making moments. So, for instance, calls for evidence from a national legislature, things like that. And again, I can give an example of a really good form of this, where QMU hosted an event similar to that today a year ago, as well as a whole body of academic outputs coming from that. The contributors got together and produced a policy brief, which is clearly written, focused on the interests of policymakers, and is spared the academic superstructure and explanation methodology, etc., which is absolutely essential to the academic work underpinning it, but is not necessarily the best way to get your findings and your message across to policymakers. This is where I reveal some of my 2026 academic cynicism, I'm afraid. We can design really exciting research projects, which we would be passionately interested in carrying out, which would advance the state of the art, and we could see making a difference to the lives of inhabitants of our small democracies. The problem we have is how to resource that sort of work. Internal resources for research in UK universities, for instance, are being seriously stretched. There have been sea changes over the last 5 years, which we can anticipate more of in the years to come. So where we might perhaps have expected to see input into a project and capacity for a project in universities, we need to be aware that that is not so easily available. The public sector, our public sector partners in the small democracies have often been stretched, doing so much with so little. Many small democracies that is accelerating. And at the state level, so the national legislatures, for instance, they similarly have very sharply constrained resources. So if you like, looking into the hinterland of our work for the resources we need to carry out projects is going to be an increasingly difficult task. So to me, external project funding is the way forward. Going to national, regional, civil society providers like UKRI, the European Commission, the Open Society Foundations, to me is a way to bring resources in to allow this important work to happen. But I do just want to stress three things, which if you're not involved in this sort of work already, you might find a bit surprising. Timeframes are depressing. It takes considerable time to write a grant. There is then typically a 9-month period during which it's being considered. So when I talk to somebody about a grant funded project, we're often talking about something to do 2 years away, which does not match frequently civil society or government timeframes. The success rates are depressing. I work on about a 1 in 12 success rate. I sit on a number of the funding body decisions, and I can say that that 1 in 12, it's not that many of the other 11 aren't good. Increasingly, it's the one that's been awarded has beaten off extraordinarily strong competition from a large number of other grants. So success rates are depressing, and the amount of front loading is depressing. In particular, if you're used to working in subjects such as law or or theoretical politics, where to some extent your research develops organically as you read and think and write and reread, the amount of forward planning and front loading of key research decisions and thinking and work you need to do for a grant is also depressing, because this is work which may not have an immediate payoff if you aren't funded. So external project funding, it is not absolutely ideal, but I'm increasingly coming to think that for ambitious comparative studies, this is where we need to be looking to develop the resources we need for our work. There are obviously other ways of bringing input in, so much smaller grants or working with partners who may have a modest amount of money for some other purposes. But for sort of the large scale work I'm talking about, I think this is really what we need to be looking to do. So I've laid out one possible agenda for research into improving criminal justice in small democracies. How might CRESCNT help with this agenda, a modified agenda, or multiple agendas for research? I think there's three ways. One of them is it can be a home to develop ideas in collaboration with others. So CRESCNT has its own members space, for instance, and I'm hoping that as we build the network, people will be able to quite easily identify possible partners with expertise which they need for a project which they don't currently have, and there will be space for people to share ideas, pictures, discussions, etc., etc. So a space to develop ideas in collaboration with people from around the world who share our interest in smallness in relation to criminal justice. It can also be a home for shared expertise. Something that I've done at Brooks is we now share our unsuccessful grant applications, part of our shadow CV, and we aim to share the original grant application as submitted, the feedback received from the reviewers, the response to the reviewers, and then the final rating. And I think if we can get into a routine where we share not only our successes but our failures as well, as a community, we will develop more expertise in successfully securing funding from the extremely competitive process I've talked about so far. And finally, I think it's another route for dissemination of findings, discussion of work in progress. The QMU day was absolutely fantastic. We need to think about doing something similar at another point, but we also need to think about ways in which people who are not able to be physically present can discuss work in progress with interested, experienced colleagues. So a way in which we can disseminate our findings or provisional findings and make the connections that today's been all about. Thank you very much.